I'm sure most of you have heard some variation of this music before. This is known as a tarantella and is a kind of music or folk dance that is primarily associated with and stemming from southern Italy and has been featured on many recordings and in movies and things like this. But this music also has a very interesting past and function connected to things like trance dancing, venomous spider bites, and maybe even ancient mystery cults. So let's explore in this video this fascinating music or folk dance tradition from southern Italy. The tarantella is a word often used as a kind of umbrella term for a variety of music or folk dance from southern Italy, from Naples all the way to Sicily. In fact, different regions have different variations and names, and they can be quite different in style and even in function. But for the sake of not overcomplicating the discussion, we'll be using the term in this way too, as a kind of umbrella term to refer to these various different traditions. The type of tarantella that most people are familiar with, the one that I played at the beginning of this video, is often known as a tarantella napolitana, and as the name suggests, is a form of this music associated with Naples or Napoli, where it dates back to at least the 16th century. This type of music functions usually as a kind of couples dance, but this cannot be said for other and older types of tarantella. Indeed, you may recognize the name as also being the name of a certain spider, the tarantula, and there is actually a fascinating connection between this type of folk dance and spiders or spider bites. It is believed that the tarantella originated in the region of Apulia, and particularly in the city of Taranto, maybe as far back as ancient times. Here, the music and dance grew out of a ritual and a medical/mental condition referred to as Tarantism. It seems that in southern Italy, and perhaps particularly in Apulia or Taranto, people would sometimes fall into a state of melancholy, appearing sick and almost on the verge of death, but upon hearing music, they would become agitated and start dancing frantically. For a long time, this condition has been thought to have been caused by a bite from the wolf spider that is local to the region. This is actually not the tarantula that we know today. But many scholars also believe that this might have been a more psychological or mental phenomenon. Whatever the case, the tarantella music and dance developed here as a healing ritual for people afflicted with tarantism. The fast rhythms of the music would cause the person to start dancing frenetically, entering a kind of trance, sometimes until they passed out. And it was thought that through this process, the venom of the spider was removed, or the mental affliction was cured. In other words, tarantella originated as a form of healing music ritual. There are videos online of people recreating or performing this dance, which will often include one person, so the afflicted one, lying on the ground with musicians standing in a circle around them. They will start to convulse to the music and eventually get up and start dancing very frantically. The kind of tarantella that is often most strongly associated with this old ritual is called the pizzica or pizzica tarantata, and is often a very high-tempo, ecstatic-sounding music. Music and dancing being used as forms of healing, medicine, or ecstasy is of course very common across history and in different cultures. From the Middle East to India, China, and Greece, the power of music to strongly affect human beings has been recognized by people all over. In the Islamic hit world, for instance, there are treatises by philosophers talking about how music can be used in a medical sense to cure illnesses, both mental and physical. And in ancient Greece, we find traditions with a similar outlook to what we are discussing today. In fact, many believe that the tarantella or pizzica dance and ritual actually originates in the Dionysian or Bacchic rites of ancient Greece. where people, often women, would work themselves up into a frenzy through things like music and dance, entering a state of ecstatic trance where they would lose themselves and become united with the god Dionysus, the deity associated with divine madness or mania. One aspect of this tradition were the so-called Maenads, women who would go into the wilderness and lose themselves through dancing and possible intoxicants. But there also seems to have been a more organized cult in the cities where both men and women participated, but which had the same characteristics of reaching altered states of consciousness through things like music and dance. This was one of the most prominent so-called mysteries or mystery cults of the ancient Hellenic world, along with others like the Eleusinian mysteries and the Pythagoreans, and was thus a popular and mainstream aspect of that culture. And considering that southern Italy had a pretty significant Hellenic presence in the ancient world, it's definitely not inconceivable that some of the practices made its way there. And based on this, many will say that the Taranta ritual might be a remnant of the ancient Dionysian rites. After the dominion of Christianity, it's likely that some of the polytheistic practices went underground, or at the very least were modified by the new theology, and Tarantella/Pizzica might be a result of that further down the line. The similarities are definitely there, as the Pizzica involves ecstatic dancing as a form of healing or medicine through altered states of consciousness and trance. Regardless, the Pizzica, which literally means bite, so referring to the spider bites associated with the affliction, the ritual, and the wider category of Tarantella developed long ago in southern Italy and became very popular and widespread. If we assume that many of those afflicted with Tarantism were suffering from psychological issues, one can imagine that such intense rituals of dancing could be very effective and help the condition in different ways. While there are different forms of Tarantella, it is actually more kind of a family of folk dances, as we have said, there are a few characteristics that define it across the board. Because the Pizzica ritual was focused on allowing the person to enter a trance, it isn't perhaps surprising that the music is very much rhythm-based, with a focus on percussion instruments like tambourines. The rhythm is often in a rapid 6/8 or 12/8 time signature, but there are also some examples of tunes in 4/4. Quoting the Italian musician Eugenio Bennato, the scholar Incoronata Inserra talks about the characteristic elements of Tarantella as being, quote, the performing style, the lack of finale, the cyclic nature of its rhythm, and a disconnect between the rhythm of the music and that of the chant that accompanies it. The particular performing style of Tarantella consists of the attitude of the musician, who appears disconnected from the audience as if he were in fact in a state of trance. This element arguably reflects the ritual energy of the Tarantella. In addition, traditional Tarantella, Bennato continues, is a, quote, music that never ends, and the finale is at any rate non-musical since it depends on two elements, the healing process or the death of the Taranti, or the end of the musician's performance due to overexertion. This particular song structure creates extremely long performances, which will often take place from sunset to sunrise in the traditional village context, and at least for several hours in a contemporary concert scenario. As for the cyclic rhythm of Tarantella, Bennato explains how the basic pattern of most Tarantella forms repeats the same standard melody over and over, which not only provides Tarantella with a trance-like obsessive quality, but also allows for a high degree of improvisation on the part of the musicians and chanters. Inserra also emphasizes the variety of Tarantella forms by stating that they can take the form of coupled dance, as four-dancer, circle dancing, and solo, and that the symbolism and function can also very much change depending on the context. Aside from the tambourines and percussion instruments, there are also often included various melody instruments such as accordions, guitars, violins, and mandolins, which create a kind of festive atmosphere. Like we said, there are different types of Tarantella. So Tarantella is a kind of family of different styles of music and folk dance, a kind of umbrella term. And so within that category, there are, for example, Pizzica that we talked about, which is most strongly associated with this old healing ritual, this ecstatic trance ritual that we talked about. On the other hand, there is the Neapolitan Tarantella that we talked about at the beginning, which is probably the most famous one around the world, which is a very sort of dancey, upbeat song that we find, it's in The Godfather, for example, and all over the place. But we also have other styles, such as tamuriata, a tradition from the region of Campania, which usually has a slower tempo and is played on the large tamorra frame drum, which is also where it gets its name. Today, the tarantella has become famous all across the world, and not just the Neapolitan one that we find in movies like The Godfather, but also other contexts such as revival movements and even in places like the New Age. People from outside of the South Italian context have started to look at tarantella and pizzica in a kind of spiritual way, using the dance as a practice of self-expression and spiritual searching. It remains popular in Italy itself too, and there are annual festivals dedicated to tarantella in Apulia, where the tradition is thought to have originated, attended by hundreds of thousands of people. In other words, this is another example of a kind of music that we can dance to and enjoy, or just another everyday thing that we don't consider, that has deep roots in history and ritual practice, maybe even dating back all the way to ancient Greece and the Dionysian mysteries and their sort of ecstatic rituals. And it also shows us how strongly connected art, such as music, has been to different religious and spiritual traditions and practices around the world. If you want to check out my music, I actually put out a new song recently. You can check that out on this channel and also on Spotify and all the streaming platforms. I will leave links to that in the description. You can also find me on my socials. I'm on Instagram and TikTok and all over the place. So I'll leave them here, and then you can also find them through my link tree in the description. I hope this was an interesting and informative video about this fascinating kind of music and folk dance from southern Italy. It connects to some of those other aspects that we often talk about in our videos, such as religion and history and philosophy. And we can see how many of these aspects of history and culture were so intertwined in history, and still is very much so today also. So thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.